All right, guys, so I've been working on this Pioneer 500 right here, and I noticed a few things that I want to remind everyone about. I think I've said all of this in videos before, but I keep seeing it more and more, so I'm going to keep making reminders because it's really important and it can save your ride. So anytime you're installing portals or aftermarket A-arms, it's really important that after the initial install, you do a ride and you recheck the torque on all these nuts, so all your ball joint nuts. Look at your snap rings, make sure that looks good, and retighten your tie rod end nut right there. Both the tie rods and all four of the ball joints on this Pioneer 500 were very loose, and that can destroy the portal backplate. You can see where that nut was moving around there and it's already dug into the metal because it's sitting there rocking like this. The same thing happens to the tie rod ends. So this is probably common sense or common knowledge, but I'm going to just explain it to people. The way a ball joint works is there's a cone, okay, and it's a tapered fit, and when you tighten the nut, you press that cone into the knuckle and it has to seat. Anytime you're doing an aftermarket knuckle or arm, the cone is not going to be perfect. It's aftermarket. So you have to let the ball joint and the knuckle wear into each other. So you torque it to, like, I don't know, 30, 40 foot-pounds, drive it around, and you'll get another half a turn out of this nut. And that's because that cone, those two cones are wearing into each other. Until they get fully seated, they can rock a little bit. And if they rock, it'll wear out the hole in here, it'll get oblong, and you'll destroy the backplate. So it's very important, I say this over and over again, when you install portals, put them on, and on the first ride, bring a wrench with you. Leave out your cotter pins if you want, so you can easily just recheck the torque a lot on the first ride. And then on the second ride, do a good ride. After the ride, check the torque again. I check the torque on these things all the time, and that's one of the reasons all of my bikes haven't had all the ball joint issues you guys have. It's because I check the torque on these things. Also, you got to look to see if your snap rings are unhappy. So the best ball joints obviously are like the Dirt Mafias and the Kellers, where there's no snap ring. There's actually a nut that screws on there, but you don't have to do that with 4-inch portals in most cases. But just keep an eye on your snap rings. If you see the snap ring getting loose, that means the ball joint starting to wobble in the control arm, and it probably means your control arms are machined wrong. So please, please, please check the torque on these. Almost every vehicle I work on that has portals has at least one ball joint nut that's loose or one tie rod and nut that's loose. Another thing I wanted to point out, specifically on these Pioneer 500s, they have very short control arms. Those control arms are shorter than a Rubicon. And this axle is really short, right? Look at how short this axle is compared to this one. So because of that, the angles are very crucial, because when you move the wheel forward, down, or whatever, the shorter the A-arm is, the more angle you have to get to move the wheel just the same distance, right? It's trigonometry. So my point in all that here is, look at the angle on this tie rod. So these are forward arms that move the front wheel forward. You got to do it on these to get clearance for 35s or whatever. The problem is that angle's terrible. So the steering rack is designed to push and pull. It's not designed to have all of this angle going on it, right? So when he's trying to steer, it's pushing the power steering rack in ways it's not really designed to work. And the more angled you have here, the less it can push. So the way to fix this, and I think Super ATV should do this from the beginning, is to not have this tie rod end mounted in the factory location. You want it back here. If you had it right here, not only would you have better leverage on turning the tire, also you'd have better angles. Now, the reason they don't do that is because it costs you some turning radius, right? You can't cut your wheel as sharp. When you put 35s on a Pioneer 500, you can't go to full lock anyways. So this is a mod a lot of people do when they're building big buggies, is they actually change the mounting point of the tie rod to make it farther away from the ball joint. The farther away it gets from the ball joint, the better leverage you have on the tire. It's easier on your power steering rack, it's easier on your tie rod end, and it's easier on your steering. It actually makes it easier for you to turn the wheel as well. This has aftermarket power steering, but most Pioneer 500s don't have power steering. So I mean, that angle right there is serious, right? So that's a mod. If I was going to build a Pioneer 500, I would cut this off and I would put it back here, and I'd weld some kind of brace up. That way it'd make it a lot more reliable, easier to steer, and wouldn't break the power steering rack. Now, why haven't I built the Pioneer 500? People ask all the time. Well, the reason is pretty simple. It's because this exists. So this has like 3 times the horsepower, about 3 times the suspension. It has an extra seat, and it has, most importantly, a front locking differential. Also, look how long my axles are, right? This thing has nice long axles. What that means is that I can lift it, I can move it forward, I can rake it, and it's got more suspension travel. So that's why I haven't built a Pioneer 500. I think they're awesome, but it's the same engine as a Rubicon. So to me, I just rather build a Rubicon that already has a front locker, better suspension, and is lighter. Now these things are awesome in the mud and in the water, pretty much unbeatable side by side wise because they're so simple. It's just a Rubicon engine and transmission, as you can see right here. That all looks real familiar, right? Just an electric shift Rubicon, but they do ride really rough. This thing's set up very well. It's on 4-inch portals, and I just did a 40% internal reduction. So as everyone should know, but I'll say it again, 4-inch portals with the 30% reduction, if you do the math the same way you do an internal gear reduction, are 41%. So this guy's got a 40 in the motor and a 41% in the portals. If you want to know what his total reduction is, you do 1.41 times 1.40. I can't do that in my head, sorry. But that would be the total reduction. You multiply those two numbers. If you want more reduction on here, you can do 6-inch portals with these same back plates. You just have to buy the 6-inch portals and swap the gear over from these portals. And then you can have a 45% according to Ray TV, which is really an 82% reduction. So if you're going to go over a 35, like you want to go like a 40, what I would do is I'd run 6-inch portals with a 45% portal box and a 40% in the engine. Now, why don't you run a bigger reduction in the engine? Someone's going to say, I want to run an 80% in the engine on my Pioneer 500. Well, here's the problem with that. The bigger the reduction is in the engine, the stiffer the clutches need to be on your disc clutch. That's the clutch that actually gets actuated by the foot shift. Well, this doesn't have a foot shift, so the actuation gets done by this motor right here. That motor will not appreciate it if you put heavy clutch springs in here. So I've actually had issues where I put a 60% and bigger in a Pioneer 500 and they started going through electric shift motors. My theory there is that you have a heavier spring in the clutch, that motor's working harder to open and close the clutches, it doesn't like it. So for those reasons, I only do 40% in Pioneer 500s for the most part. Another reason is if you put a really big reduction in a Pioneer 500 and you don't do portals, you'll break the rear diff. The rear diff on a Pioneer 500 is geared lower than on a Rubicon, and because of that, the pinion gear has one less tooth, so it's smaller, which means you have less tooth contact, which means you just rip the teeth off the pinion gear. So if you're going to put big tires on a Pioneer 500, I think the best way to do it is portals and a small internal reduction. If I was going to build one, I wouldn't personally go over a 35 because they don't have enough power to clean them out. You can make them turn it, but it's going to be very slow. You're going to be shifting gears every 2 seconds, and they're not going to clean out super well. So I think a perfect setup would be like a 33 or a 35-inch Aztec on 4-inch portals. But I think this guy's going to go bigger. He wants to go to 40s, and it'll do okay with the 4-inch portals, the 40% internal. On 40s, if in water and thin stuff, you want to go in real thick mud, you really need to do the 6-inch portals with the 45% reduction, which, as we said earlier, is actually an 82% reduction. But yeah, this thing's also got a pretty cool radiator relocate. You can see this is cut out and the radiator's up here instead of down there, so it does raise it up a lot. One issue with a lot of these radiator relocates is they're leaned back really far. You can't really see it. They're leaned back really far, which means it's hard to get them completely full of coolant. So what I did with this thing was I parked it pointed downhill on my hill over there. That would get the radiator totally full of coolant. Also, important thing to know, if you're going to do a Pioneer 500 gear reduction or top end, you have to bleed the coolant system. It's not like a foiler. There's a coolant bleed valve, which is going to be kind of hard to see. I'm going to zoom in on it. That's it right there, that 10mm bolt right in the center of the screen. That's the coolant bleed port. I'm going to zoom out so you can see where it is again. It's buried up in there on top of the cylinder head in front of the spark plug boot. You have to pull that screw out to bleed it, or this thing will overheat immediately. Yeah, so there's some interesting info for you guys on a Pioneer 500. And like I said, please torque your portal ball joints. I'm so tired of riding with people and seeing their wheels going like this because they don't torque their portal ball joints. Chris, I'm talking about you.